The Garden of Paradise, 1839. There was once a king's son. No one had so many beautiful books as he. In them he could read of everything that had ever happened in this world, and he could see it all pictured in fine illustrations. He could find out about every race of people and every country, but there was not a single word about where to find the Garden of Paradise. And just this, was the very thing he thought most about. When he was still very young and was about to start his schooling, his grandmother had told him that each flower in the Garden of Paradise was made of the sweetest cake, and that the pistils were bottles full of finest wine. On one sort of flower, she told, history was written, on another geography or multiplication table, so that one only had to eat cake to know one's lesson. And the one more ate, the more history, geography, or arithmetic one would know. At the time, he believed her. But when the boy grew older and more learned, and much wiser, he knew that the glories of the Garden of Paradise must be of a very different sort. Well, why did Eve have to pick fruit from the tree of knowledge, and why did Adam eat what was forbidden him? Now, if it had only been I, that would never have happened, and sin would never have come into the world. He said it then, and when he was 17, he said it still. The Garden of Paradise was always in his thoughts. He went walking in the woods one day. He walked alone, for this was his favorite amusement. Evening came on, the clouds gathered, and the rain poured down as if the sky were all one big floodgate from which the water plunged. It was as dark as it would be at night in the deepest well. He kept slipping on the wet grass and tripping over the stones that stuck out of the rocky soil. Everything was soaking wet, and at length the poor prince didn't have a dry stitch to his back. He had to scramble over great boulders where the water trickled from the wet moss. He had almost fainted when he heard a strange puffing and saw a huge cave ahead of him. It was brightly lit, for inside the cave burned a fire so large that it could have roasted a stag. And this was actually being done. A magnificent deer, antlers and all, had been stuck on a spit and was being slowly turned between the rough-hewn trunks of 2 pine trees. An elderly woman, so burly and strong that she might have been taken for a man in disguise, sat by the fire and threw log upon it. "You can come nearer," she said. "Sit down by the fire and let your clothes dry." "There's an awful draught in here," the prince remarked as he seated himself on the ground. "It will be still worse when my sons get home," the woman told him. "You are in the cave of the winds, and my son are the 4 winds of the world. Do I make myself clear?" "Where are your sons?" the prince asked. "Such a stupid question is hard to answer," the woman told him. "My sons go their own ways, playing ball with the clouds in that great hall." And she pointed up toward the sky. "Really," said the prince, "I notice that you have a rather forceful way of speaking and are not as gentle as the women I usually see around me. I suppose they have nothing better to do. I have to be harsh to control those sons of mine. I manage to do it for all that they are an obstinate lot. See the 4 sacks that hang there on the wall. They dread those as much as you used to dread the switch that was kept behind the mirror for you. I can fold the boys right up, let me tell you, and pop them straight into the bag. We don't mince matters. There they stay. They aren't allowed to roam around again until I see fit to let them. But here comes one of them." It was the north wind who came hurtling in with a cold blast of snowflakes that swirled about him, and great hailstones that rattled onto the floor. He was wearing a bearskin coat and trousers. A sealskin cap was pulled over his ears. Long icicles hung from his beard, and hailstone after hailstone fell from the collar of his coat. "Don't go right up to the fire so quickly," the prince warned him. "Your face and hands might get frostbite." "Frostbite?" The north wind laughed his loudest. "Frostbite? Why, frost is my chief delight. But what sort of long leg are you? How do you come to be in the cave of the winds?" "He is here as my guest," the old woman intervened. "And if that explanation doesn't suit you, into the sack you go. Do I make myself clear?" She made herself clear enough. The north wind now talked of whence he had come, and where he had traveled for almost a month. "I come from the Arctic Sea," he told them. "I have been on a bare island with the Russian walrus hunters. I lay beside the helm and slept as they sailed from the North Cape. When I awoke from time to time, the storm bird circled about my knees. There's an odd bird for you. He gives a quick flap of his wings and then holds them perfectly still and rushes along at full speed." "Don't be so long-winded," his mother told him. "So you came to Bear Island? It's a wonderful place. There's a dancing floor for you, as flat as a platter. The surface of the island is all half-melted snow. Little patches of moss and outcropping rocks. Scattered about are the bones of whales and polar bears, colored a moldy green and looking like the arms and legs of some giant. You'd have thought the sun never shone there. I blew the fog away a bit so that the house could be seen. It was a hut built of wreckage and covered with walrus skins. The fleshy side turned outward and smeared with reds and greens. A lovely polar bear sat growling on the roof of it. I went to the shore and looked at birds' nests, and when I saw the featherless nestlings shrieking with their beaks wide open, I blew down into their 1,000 throats. That taught them to shut their mouths. Further along, great walruses were wallowing about like monstrous maggots with pig heads and tusks a yard long. "How well you do tell a story, my son," the old woman said. "My mouth waters when I hear you." The hunt began. The harpoon was hurled into the walrus breast, and a streaming bloodstream spurted across the ice like a fountain. This reminded me of my own sport. I blew my sailing ships, those towering icebergs, against the boats until their timbers cracked. Ho! How the crew whistled and shouted, but I outwhistled them all. Overboard on the ice, they had to throw their dead walruses, their tackle, and even their sea chests. I shrouded them in snow and let them drift south with their broken boats and their booty alongside for a taste of the open sea. They won't ever come back to Bear Island. "That was a wicked thing to do," said the Mother of the Winds. "I'll let others tell of my good deeds," he said. "But here comes my brother from the west. I like him best of all. He has a seafaring air about him and carries a refreshing touch of coolness wherever he goes." "Is that little Sapphire?" the prince asked. "Of course it's Sapphire," the old woman replied. "But he's not little. He was a nice boy once, but that was years ago. He looked like a savage, except that he wore a broad-rimmed hat to shield his face. In his hand he carried a mahogany bludgeon cut in the mahogany forests of America. Nothing less would do." "Where have you come from?" his mother asked. "I come from the forest wilderness," he said, "where the thorny vines make a fence between every tree, where the water snake lurks in the wet grass, and where people seem unnecessary." "What were you doing there?" "I gazed into the deepest of rivers and saw how it rushed through the rapids and threw up a cloud of spray large enough to hold the rainbow. I saw a wild buffalo wading in the river, but it swept him away. He swam with a flock of wild ducks that flew up when the river went over a waterfall, but the buffalo had to plunge down it. That amused me so much that I blew up a storm which broke age-old trees into splinters." "Haven't you done anything else?" the old woman asked him. "I turned somersaults across the plains, stroked the wild horses, and shook coconuts down from the palm trees. Yes, indeed, I have tales worth telling, but one shouldn't tell all he knows. Isn't that right, old lady?" Then he gave her such a kiss that it nearly knocked her over backward. He was certainly a wild young fellow. Then the south wind arrived in a turban and a Bedouin's billowing robe. "It's dreadfully cold in here," he cried, and threw more wood on the fire. "I can tell that the north wind got here before me." "It's hot enough to roast a polar bear here," the north wind protested. "You are a polar bear yourself," the south wind said. "Do you want to be put into the sack?" the old woman asked. "Sit down on that stone over there and tell me where you have been." "In Africa, dear mother," said he. "I have been hunting the lion with Hottentots in Kafir land. What fine grass grows there on the plains! It is as green as an olive. There danced the gnu and the ostrich raced with me, but I am a fleeter than he is. I went into the desert where the yellow sand is like the bottom of the sea. I met with a caravan where they were killing their last camel to get drinking water, but it was little enough they got. The sun blazed overhead and the sand scorched underfoot. The desert was unending. I rolled in the fine loose sand and whirled it aloft in great columns. What a dance that was! You ought to have seen how despondently the dromedaries hunched up and how the trader pulled his burnous over his head. He threw himself down before me as he would before Allah his God. Now they are buried with a pyramid of sand rising over them all. When someday I blow it away, the sun will bleach their bones white and travelers will see that men have been there before them. Otherwise, no one would believe it, there in the desert. So you have done nothing but wickedness, cried his mother. Into the sack with you! And before he was aware of it, she picked the south wind up bodily and thrust him into the bag. He thrashed about on the floor until she sat down on the sack. That kept him quiet. Those are boisterous sons you have, said the prince. Indeed they are, she agreed, but I know how to keep them in order. Here comes the fourth one. This was the east wind. He was dressed as a Chinaman. So that's where you've been, said his mother. I thought you had gone to the Garden of Paradise. I won't fly there until tomorrow, the east wind said. Tomorrow it will be exactly 100 years since I was there. I am just home from China, where I danced around the porcelain tower until all the bells jangled. Officials of state were being whipped through the streets. Bamboo sticks were broken across their shoulders, though they were people of importance from the 1st to the 9th degree. They howled. Thank you so much, my father and protector, but they didn't mean it, and I went about clanging the bells and saying, Sing, sang, Sue. You are too saucy, the old woman told him. It's a lucky thing that you'll be off to the Garden of Paradise tomorrow, for it always has a good influence on you. Remember to drink deep out of the fountain of wisdom and bring back a little bottle full for me. I'll do that, said the east wind. But why have you popped my brother from the south into the sack? Let's have him out. He must tell me about the phoenix bird, because the princess in the Garden of Paradise always asks me about that bird when I drop in on her every 100 years. Open up my sack like my own sweet mother, and I'll give you 2 pockets full of tea, as green and fresh as it was when I picked it off the bush. Well, for the sake of the tea and because you are my pet, I'll open the sack. She opened it up and the south wind crawled out, but he looked very glum, because the prince, who was a stranger, had seen him humbled. Here's a palm leaf fan for the princess, the south wind said. It was given to me by the old phoenix, who was the only one of his kind in the world. On it he scratched with his beak a history of the 100 years that he lived, so she can read it herself. I watched the phoenix bird set fire to her nest and sat there while she burned to death, just like a Hindu widow. What a crackling there was of dry twigs, what smoke, and what a smell of smoldering. Finally, it all burst into flames, and the old phoenix was reduced to ashes, but her egg lay white hot in the blaze. With a great bang, it broke open, and the young phoenix flew out of it. Now he is the ruler over all the birds, and he is the only phoenix bird in all the world. As his greetings to the princess, he thrust a hole in the palm leaf I am giving you. Let's have a bite to eat, said the mother of the winds. As they sat down to eat the roast stag, the prince took a place beside the east wind, and they soon became fast friends. Tell me, said the prince, who is this princess you've been talking so much about, and just where is the Garden of Eden? Aha, said the east wind. Would you like to go there? Then fly with me tomorrow. I must warn you, though, no man has been there since Adam and Eve. You have read about them in the Bible? Surely, the prince said. After they were driven out, the Garden of Paradise sank deep into the earth, but it kept its warm sunlight, its refreshing air, and all of its glories. The queen of the fairies lived there on the island of the blessed, where death never comes, and where there is everlasting happiness. Sit on my back tomorrow, and I shall take you with me. I think it can be managed. But now let's stop talking, for I want to sleep. And they all went to sleep. When the prince awoke the next morning, it came as no small surprise to find himself high over the clouds. He was seated on the back of the East Wind, who carefully held him safe. They were so far up in the sky that all the woods, fields, rivers, and lakes looked as if they were printed on a map spread beneath them. "Good morning," said the East Wind. "You might just as well sleep a little longer. There's nothing very interesting in this flat land beneath us, unless you care to count churches. They stand out like chalk marks upon the green board." What he called the green board was all the fields and pastures. "It was not very polite of me to leave without bidding your mother and your brothers farewell," the prince said. "That's excusable when you leave in your sleep," the East Wind told him, as they flew on faster than ever. One could hear it in the treetops. All the leaves and branches rustled as they swept over the forest, and when they crossed over lakes or over seas, the waves rose high, and tall ships bent low to the water as if they were drifting swans. As darkness gathered that evening, it was pleasant to see the great cities with their lights twinkling here and spreading there, just as when you burn a piece of paper and the sparks fly one after another. At this sight, the prince clapped his hands in delight, but the East Wind advised him to stop it and hold on tight, or he might fall and find himself stuck upon a church steeple. The eagle in the dark forest flew lightly, but the East Wind flew more lightly still. The Cossack on his pony sped swiftly across the steppes, but the prince sped still more swiftly. "Now," said the East Wind, "you can view the Himalayas, the highest mountains in Asia, and soon we shall reach the Garden of Paradise." They turned southward, where the air was sweet with the flowers and spice. Figs and pomegranates grew wild, and an untended vine grew red, and blue clusters of grapes. They came down here, and both of them stretched out on the soft grass, where flowers nodded in the breeze as if to say, "Welcome back." "Are we now in the Garden of Paradise?" the prince asked. "Oh, no," said the East Wind, "but we shall come to it soon. Do you see that rocky cliff and the big cave where the vines hang in the wind, in the wide curtain of greenery? That's the way we go. Wrap your coat well about you. Here the sun is scorching hot, but a few steps and it is cold as ice. The bird that flies at the mouth of the cave has one wing in summery and the other in wintry air. So this is the way to the Garden of Paradise," said the prince, as they entered the cave. Brr, how frosty it was there, but not for long. The East Wind spread his wings, and they shone like the brightest flames. But what a cave that was! Huge masses of rock from which water was trickling hung in fantastic shapes above them. Sometimes the cave was so narrow that they had to crawl on their hands and knees, sometimes so vast that it seemed that they were under the open sky. The cave resembled a series of funeral chapels with mute organ pipes and banners turned to stone. "We are going to the Garden of Paradise through the gates of death, are we not?" the prince asked. The East Wind answered not a word, but pointed to a lovely blue light that shone ahead of them. The masses of stone over their heads grew more and more misty, and at last they looked up a clear white cloud in the moonlight. The air became delightfully clement, as fresh as it is in the hills, and as sweetly scented as it is among the roses that bloom in the valley. The river that flowed there was clear as the air itself, and the fish in it were like silver and gold. Purple eels that at every turn threw off blue sparks frolicked about in the water, and the large leaves of the aquatic flowers gleamed in all the rainbow's colors. The flowers themselves were like a bright orange flame, which fed on the water just as lamplight is fed by oil. A strong marble bridge made so delicately and artistically that it looked as if it consisted of lace and glass pearls, led across the water to the island of the blessed, where the Garden of Paradise bloomed. The East Wind swept the prince up in his arms and carried him across the island, where the petals and leaves sang all the lovely old songs of his childhood, but far, far sweeter than any human voice could sing. Were these palm trees that grew up there, or immense water plants? Such vast and verdant trees the prince had never seen before. The most marvelous climbing vines hung in garlands such as are to be seen only in the old illuminated church books painted in gold and bright colors in the margins, or twinned about the initial letters. Here was the oddest assortment of birds, flowers, and twisting vines. On the grass nearby, with their brilliantly starred tails spread wide, was a flock of peacocks, or so they seemed, but when the prince touched them, he found that these were not birds, they were plants. They were large burdock leaves that were as resplendent as the peacock's train. Lions and tigers leaped about, as lithe as cats, in the green shrubbery that the olive blossoms made so fragrant. The lions and tigers were quite tame, for the wildwood pigeon, which glistened like a lovely pearl, brushed the lion's mane with her wings, and the timid antelopes stood by and tossed their heads, as if they would like to join in their play. And the fairy of the garden came to meet them. Her garments were as bright as the sun, and her face was as cheerful as that of a happy mother who was well pleased with her child. She was so young and lovely, and the other pretty maidens who followed her each wore a shining star in their hair. When the east wind gave her the palm leaf message from the phoenix, her eyes sparkled with pleasure.